You're just a burden now, my daughter-in-law whispered into my ear at my 70th birthday party while everyone around us kept smiling and raising their champagne glasses as if she had said something pleasant instead of something that made my heart stop for a second. I didn't answer her. I just sat there at the long dining table staring at the flickering candles reflected in the crystal glasses Harold and I had bought during our anniversary trip to Vermont nearly 20 years ago. The dining room was warm with golden light and soft jazz music played quietly through the speakers, but suddenly the whole house felt cold to me. My son Daniel was carving the roast at the end of the table, while my grandchildren argued over slices of chocolate cake. Vanessa leaned back into her chair with a small smile on her face, calm and polished like always, as though she hadn't just reduced me to a problem that needed to be removed. I looked at Daniel waiting for him to say something, anything at all. But he avoided my eyes and reached for his wine glass instead. That silence hurt more than her words. Harold used to say that silence could reveal the truth about a person faster than anger ever could. I understood what he meant that night. The birthday decorations suddenly looked ridiculous to me. The silver balloons spelling out 70. The flowers arranged carefully across the table. The navy blue dress I had spent 2 weeks searching for because Vanessa insisted we needed professional family photos for the occasion. I had spent the entire afternoon cooking Daniel's favorite meal even though my arthritis made standing in the kitchen painful after an hour.
Pot ruast, mashaputatuas, umamada rois, pa kuble.
Things that once made this house feel like home. Vanessa picked at her salad while checking messages on her phone every few minutes. She barely looked at me unless other people were watching. Then she would smile brightly and call me Mom, in that rehearsed voice that never sounded real. Across the room, my granddaughter Emily was helping her little brother light the candles on my cake. For a moment I focused only on them. Children still loved honestly. They hadn't learned how to disguise cruelty inside politeness yet. Make a wish, Grandma, Emily said excitedly. Everyone turned toward me. I smiled because that was what people expected from women like me. Women who spent their entire lives keeping peace inside families, even while pieces of themselves disappeared quietly over the years. I leaned forward and blew out the candles while everyone clapped. But I didn't make a wish. Somewhere deep inside me, something had already changed. I noticed the way Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with Daniel after the applause faded. It was brief, almost invisible, but I saw it. And suddenly I realized this birthday dinner wasn't really about celebrating me at all. It felt more like the beginning of something they had already planned long before I sat down at that table. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and listened to my family laugh around me while a strange heaviness settled into my chest. Harold's chair at the head of the table remained empty, just like it had every night since his funeral 8 months earlier. And for the first time since losing him, I had the terrible feeling that I was completely alone inside my own home. After everyone left that night, I stayed in the dining room long after the music stopped playing. Half-empty wine glasses still sat scattered across the table beside crumpled napkins and melted birthday candles. The house smelled faintly of vanilla frosting and roasted meat, but underneath it lingered the sharp scent of loneliness that had settled into these rooms ever since Harold died. I gathered the plates slowly because my hands ached more at night now. The arthritis always seemed worse when the house became quiet. Harold used to stand beside me after family dinners, drying dishes while humming old Frank Sinatra songs under his breath. He never let me clean alone. Even after 47 years of marriage, he still reached for my hand whenever we crossed a parking lot together. Sometimes I still caught myself listening for the sound of his footsteps upstairs before remembering there would never be footsteps again. I opened the refrigerator and stared at the untouched birthday cake balanced carefully. On the middle shelf, Vanessa had ordered it from an expensive bakery downtown. 3 layers. White buttercream frosting. Gold lettering. Beautiful to look at but strangely flavorless once you tasted it. That reminded me of her. I closed the refrigerator and leaned against the counter for a moment as exhaustion settled deep into my bones. 8 months earlier, after Harold's funeral, this house had still felt full of him. His reading glasses remained on the nightstand. His winter coat still hung near the front door. I could almost believe he had simply stepped out for coffee and would return any minute complaining about Connecticut traffic. But slowly little things began disappearing. Vanessa offered to help organize closets one weekend, and somehow Harold's old sweaters vanished into donation boxes before I realized what she was doing. Daniel stopped asking before moving things around the house. One afternoon I came home from the grocery store and discovered Harold's study locked for the first time in 40 years. Daniel explained they were reorganizing paperwork. He said it casually while staring down at his phone instead of at me. Another time I noticed family photos missing from the hallway. The framed picture from our trip to Cape Cod. The one of Harold teaching Daniel how to fish at Lake George when he was 8 years old. Vanessa replaced them with modern abstract paintings in cold shades of gray and beige. The house needed a fresher look, she explained with a bright smile. Fresh. That was the word she used every time she erased another piece of my life from these rooms. I carried the last stack of dishes to the sink and paused when I noticed Daniel's voice drifting softly from the den. The door was partially closed. Vanessa answered him in a low tone I could not fully hear. Then I caught my own name. Instinctively I stopped moving. She cannot stay here forever, Vanessa whispered. Silence followed. Heavy silence. Then Daniel sighed quietly, the way Harold used to sigh whenever he faced something difficult. I know, he finally said. Just give me time. My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. For several seconds I could hear nothing, except the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway. I stood completely still in the dim kitchen light while something cold and unfamiliar settled inside my chest. It was not grief anymore. Grief felt softer than this. This felt like the beginning of understanding. The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I always had since Harold passed away. Sleep came lightly these days, fragile and uncertain. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the old pipes ticking faintly behind the walls. For a few seconds, lying there in the pale blue light filtering through the curtains, I almost forgot everything. Then Vanessa's voice returned to me as clearly as if she were standing beside the bed. You're just a burden now. I sat up slowly and wrapped my robe tighter around myself before walking downstairs. Harold used to make coffee every morning before I even came into the kitchen. He claimed nobody should have to face the world uncaffeinated. I could still picture him standing barefoot by the counter in his flannel pajama pants, reading the newspaper while the coffee brewed. The memory hit me unexpectedly hard that morning. I stood alone in the kitchen holding my mug with both hands, staring out at the backyard where frost covered the grass like a thin layer of silver dust. Connecticut winters always arrived early near the coast. By 7 o'clock I heard movement upstairs. Cabinet doors opened. Footsteps crossed the hallway. Vanessa came downstairs dressed in cream-colored workout clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She smiled politely when she saw me sitting at the table. Good morning, Eleanor, she said smoothly. Eleanor. Not Mom anymore. I noticed that change months ago. Good morning, I answered quietly. She poured herself a glass of lemon water and immediately began typing messages on her phone. Her wedding ring flashed beneath the kitchen lights every time her fingers moved. We sat in silence for several minutes until Daniel entered wearing his office clothes, already looking tired. He kissed Vanessa quickly on the cheek before grabbing a banana from the counter. Morning, Mom, he said. Distractedly. Morning. He opened the refrigerator and frowned. Where is the orange juice? I stopped buying it, I said. Nobody was drinking it. Vanessa let out a soft laugh without looking up from her phone. Well, maybe if we had a little more space in this kitchen things would not get so cluttered all the time. The comment sounded casual, almost harmless. But I understood what she meant. Everything with Vanessa worked that way. Tiny cuts. Quiet suggestions. Never direct enough for anyone else to notice. Daniel avoided my eyes again. He checked his watch twice during breakfast even though he was not late. The tension around him had become constant these past few months. Harold would have noticed it immediately. Harold noticed everything. After Daniel left for work, I carried my coffee into the hallway and stopped suddenly when I saw a stack of cardboard boxes near the staircase. Large moving boxes, folded flat but clearly brand new. My stomach tightened. Vanessa appeared behind me almost instantly. Oh, those, she said brightly. I ordered them for some organizing projects upstairs. I nodded slowly even though something about her smile felt rehearsed. Later that afternoon, while searching for a photo album in Harold's old study, I discovered the filing cabinet drawer slightly open. Inside, several folders were missing. Specifically the folders containing property records and financial paperwork Harold always kept carefully organized. I stood there staring at the empty space between the files while an uneasy feeling crept through me. Harold trusted Daniel completely. He used to say family protected family. But standing alone in that quiet room surrounded by the smell of old paper and cedar wood, I began realizing something painful. Sometimes people stop seeing you as family long before they admitted it out loud. 2 days later, rain covered the town in a cold gray mist that blurred the windows and made the entire house feel smaller somehow. Daniel left early for work without finishing breakfast, and Vanessa spent most of the morning upstairs speaking quietly on the phone behind closed doors. I tried reading in the living room, but my attention drifted every few minutes toward the staircase whenever I heard footsteps overhead. The uneasiness inside me had grown impossible to ignore. It followed me from room to room like a shadow. Around noon, I decided to clean out the hallway closet near Harold's old study. It was something practical to do with my hands, something ordinary. I folded winter scarves, stacked old photo albums, and sorted through boxes of Christmas decorations while the rain tapped softly against the windows. Then I heard voices downstairs. Vanessa's voice first. Sharp but controlled. Daniel answered more quietly. They thought I was upstairs resting. I stood still without meaning to, one hand frozen around an old string of holiday lights. "We cannot keep waiting forever," Vanessa whispered. "The market is perfect right now. If we refinance before spring, we can finally start the renovations." Daniel sounded exhausted. "I told you she is still grieving." "She has been grieving for 8 months, Daniel." Silence followed. I moved closer to the door, my heartbeat suddenly loud in my ears. "This house is too large for her anyway," Vanessa continued. "You know that. The stairs are becoming difficult for her, and she barely uses half these rooms. A senior community would actually be better for her." Better for her. I stared at the dark wooden banister while a strange numbness spread through my chest. They were discussing my future the same way people discuss replacing an old roof or remodeling a kitchen. Practical. Detached. Temporary. Daniel sighed again. "I just do not want this to turn ugly." Vanessa let out a soft laugh. "Only if you let emotions get involved." I heard the sound of papers sliding across the dining room table. "Look at the numbers. Once the house is in our name, we can finally breathe again financially." In our name. My fingers tightened around the railing so hard my knuckles ached. Harold and I spent 32 years paying off this house. We painted every room ourselves. We planted the maple tree in the backyard when Daniel turned 10 years old, because Harold wanted him to grow up with something permanent to come home to someday. Suddenly I understood why the filing cabinet folders were missing. Why Vanessa had started removing photographs. Why moving boxes sat near the staircase. This was not concern. This was preparation. I backed away quietly before the floorboards could creak beneath me. My chest felt tight, but not from tears. The tears had already burned themselves out months ago beside Harold's hospital bed. What remained now was colder than sadness. I walked slowly into Harold's study and closed the door behind me. The room still smelled faintly of cedar, old books, and his aftershave. Rain streaked down the windows while the grandfather clock ticked steadily near the bookshelf. I sat in Harold's leather chair and looked around the room they had already started treating like abandoned space. Then my eyes landed on a framed photograph sitting beside the desk lamp. Harold smiling beside me during our anniversary trip to Maine 5 years earlier. His arm wrapped around my shoulders. His expression calm and certain. Beneath the photograph sat a small brass key I had not noticed before. I stared at it for several seconds before slowly reaching toward it, and for the first time in months, I felt the faintest shift inside me. Not hope exactly. Something quieter. Something waking up. The brass key stayed in my robe pocket for 2 days before I finally gathered the courage to use it. I carried it with me constantly, touching it sometimes while washing dishes or folding laundry as though Harold himself had quietly placed it in my hand. Vanessa and Daniel continued moving through the house like people preparing for a future they assumed was already guaranteed. One evening I came downstairs and found Vanessa measuring the dining room walls while scrolling through renovation photos on her tablet. "Open floor plans increase resale value," she explained casually when she noticed me watching. I simply nodded and continued making tea. The less I reacted, the more comfortable she became. That Friday morning, Daniel left for Boston for a work conference, and Vanessa drove the children to school before heading to a yoga class downtown. I watched her car disappear down the street through the living room curtains before quietly locking the front door behind her. Then I walked upstairs to Harold's study carrying the brass key in my trembling hand. The old mahogany desk sat exactly where it always had beneath the windows overlooking the backyard. For a long moment I simply stood there listening to the silence. Then I noticed a small locked drawer hidden behind a row of leather-bound books at the bottom of the bookshelf. My pulse quickened immediately. I knelt carefully and inserted the key. The lock clicked open almost effortlessly. Inside rested a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Harold's familiar handwriting. Eleanor. Just seeing his handwriting again nearly broke me. I sat down slowly in his chair before opening the envelope with shaking fingers. Inside was a letter dated 6 months before his death. My dearest Ellie, if you are reading this, then I am no longer there to protect you myself. I stopped breathing for a second. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm behind me. Harold's words felt so alive on the page that I could almost hear his voice. I know you believe love alone keeps families together, but sometimes love makes good people blind. Daniel has a kind heart, but kindness without strength can become weakness in the wrong hands. I fear Vanessa sees this house as an opportunity, not a home. If things begin changing after I am gone, you need to contact Margaret Hale immediately. Everything important is already arranged. Beneath the letter rested a business card with Margaret's phone number handwritten on the back. Margaret Hale had been Harold's attorney and closest friend for more than 30 years. We spent holidays together once. She even attended Daniel's high school graduation party. But after Harold became sick, we slowly lost touch beneath hospital visits and endless medical appointments. My hand shook as I reached for the phone on Harold's desk. Margaret answered after the second ring. Her voice sounded older but steady. "Eleanor?" she said softly after I introduced myself. "I was wondering when you might call." Silence filled the room around me. "You knew," I whispered. "Harold asked me to wait until you were ready," she replied carefully. He wanted to believe he was wrong about certain things, but he prepared anyway. I closed my eyes tightly as emotion rose unexpectedly into my chest. Not grief this time. Relief. Harold had seen what I could not. Even near the end of his life, while fighting through pain he rarely complained about, he had still been trying to protect me. Margaret spoke gently for nearly an hour. By the time the conversation ended, the rain had stopped outside and pale sunlight stretched across Harold's desk. I sat there quietly staring at the family photographs lining the shelves around me while a calmness slowly settled over my thoughts. Vanessa believed I was fragile. Daniel believed I was unaware. For the first time since Harold's funeral, I understood how dangerous those assumptions might become for them. After my conversation with Margaret, I stopped reacting to anything Vanessa said. That seemed to confuse her more than anger ever would have. The following week, she walked through the kitchen describing expensive renovation ideas, while I prepared chicken soup for the children. Marble countertops, new hardwood floors, expanding the dining room into the sunroom. She spoke as though the house already belonged to her. I simply stirred the soup and listened quietly. The market value could easily double after renovations, she said while scrolling through photos on her tablet. Especially in this neighborhood. I smiled faintly without looking up. That sounds lovely. For a brief second, I caught surprise flicker across her face. She expected resistance, fear, tears. Instead, I gave her calmness, and calmness unsettled people like Vanessa because they could not easily control it. Daniel noticed the change too. One evening, he found me sitting in the den reading beside the fireplace while snow drifted softly outside the windows. He stood there awkwardly for a moment with his hands in his pockets before finally speaking. "You seem different lately." I turned a page slowly. "Doi. You have been quiet." I almost laughed at the irony of that statement. Quiet. Women my age spent entire lifetimes being quiet so other people could remain comfortable. "I think I am just tired," I answered gently. He nodded but continued standing there as though guilt itself had rooted him to the floor. For a moment I saw the little boy he used to be. The child who cried whenever he accidentally stepped on insects in the garden, because he hated hurting anything. Harold always said Daniel had too soft a heart for this world. Unfortunately, softness became dangerous when mixed with weakness. "Mom," he started carefully, "Vanessa and I have been discussing some future plans." There it was. Future plans. Words people used when they wanted to make selfish decisions sound responsible. I closed my book calmly and looked at him directly for the first time in days. His eyes shifted away almost immediately. "I assumed so," I replied. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "We just want what is best for everyone." I noticed he never actually said what was best for me. "Of course," I said softly. "Families should always plan ahead." Relief visibly spread across his face. He mistook my composure for surrender. That was exactly what Margaret advised me to let them believe. 2 days later, I met Margaret at a small cafe near the harbor in Mystic. Snow covered the sidewalks outside while people hurried past carrying shopping bags and cups of coffee beneath gray winter skies. Margaret wore a dark wool coat and still carried herself with the same sharp confidence she always had. She placed a thick folder carefully on the table between us. "Harold was very thorough," she said quietly. Inside the folder were trust documents, property records, and handwritten notes from Harold himself. My chest tightened as I recognized his careful handwriting across the margins. Margaret explained everything slowly, while I listened in stunned silence. The house had never legally transferred to Daniel after Harold's death. The trust remained entirely under my control. Even more shocking, Harold included specific protections preventing anyone from pressuring me to leave the property. If anyone attempted it, certain financial benefits would disappear permanently. I stared out the cafe window at the falling snow while Margaret spoke. Harold knew. Somehow he understood exactly what might happen after he was gone. "He loved you very much, Eleanor," Margaret said softly. I swallowed hard and folded my gloves carefully in my lap. Love. Real love protected people even in absence. That realization settled deep inside me as quietly as snowfall. When I returned home that evening, Vanessa barely glanced up from her phone before asking what I wanted for dinner. I removed my coat slowly and looked around the kitchen that suddenly felt very different to me now. Not because the house had changed, because I finally understood I was not the powerless woman they believed I had become. The strange thing about betrayal is that once you finally see it clearly, you begin noticing all the small moments that led there. Little expressions, half-finished conversations, doors closing softly when you enter a room. After my meeting with Margaret, the entire house felt different to me, as though invisible curtains had finally been pulled back from the windows. Vanessa became unusually cheerful during the days leading up to Christmas. She played holiday music while decorating the staircase with expensive garland and white lights. She ordered new furniture catalogs and left them open across the kitchen island where I could easily see them. Cream-colored sofas, modern dining sets, minimalist bedroom designs that looked more like hotel suites than family homes. One afternoon, while I was wrapping presents for Emily and Noah at the dining room table, Vanessa walked in carrying fabric samples. "I was thinking lighter colors would brighten this whole space," she said casually, laying the samples beside my coffee cup. "Especially once we open the walls up." I folded another piece of wrapping paper carefully before answering. "You seem very certain about future renovations." She smiled without hesitation. "Well, Daniel and I are trying to think long-term now, especially with the children growing up so fast." Long-term. Again that phrase. Always spoken as though my own future no longer existed inside their plans. I tied a ribbon around Emily's present and looked down at my hands. The diamond wedding ring Harold gave me 48 years earlier still rested on my finger. Simple. Elegant.
Permanent.
Unlike the temporary smiles people wore when they wanted something from you. That evening, Daniel suggested we all have dinner together in the formal dining room for the first time in weeks. Vanessa cooked salmon with roasted vegetables and lit candles beside the centerpieces she had recently purchased. The room looked beautiful in the soft golden light, but the atmosphere beneath it felt tense and artificial, like actors performing happiness for an audience that was no longer there. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa placed her fork down carefully and exchanged a glance with Daniel. I recognized that look immediately now. rehearsed, coordinated. Eleanor, she began sweetly, Daniel and I have been researching some wonderful retirement communities nearby. There it was, finally spoken aloud. Daniel cleared his throat and focused on his plate instead of my face. Mom, we just think you deserve less stress. I took a slow sip of water before answering. Stress from what exactly? Neither of them spoke immediately. Vanessa stepped in smoothly. This house is simply too much responsibility for someone your age. The stairs, the maintenance. The winters here can be difficult. Snow drifted softly outside the windows behind her, while the candlelight reflected against her wine glass. She looked calm, compassionate even. Anyone listening casually might have believed she truly cared. That was what made people like Vanessa dangerous. Cruelty hidden beneath politeness became almost impossible for others to challenge. Daniel finally looked up. The community we found has activities, healthcare staff, transportation. It might actually make life easier for you. Easier. Such a gentle word for removal. I studied my son quietly across the table. Gray streaks had started appearing near his temples recently. Harold had the same gray hair at that age. For one painful moment, I wondered if Harold would even recognize the man sitting there now. And what would happen to the house? I asked softly. Vanessa answered too quickly. Well, obviously Daniel and I would manage things here. Of course they would. The silence that followed stretched heavily across the room. Finally, I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate and gave them a small smile. I understand, I said calmly. Relief flashed instantly across Daniel's face. Vanessa relaxed back into her chair, as though some invisible battle had finally ended in her favor. Neither of them realized that people become most dangerous precisely when others mistake their silence for defeat. 3 days after that dinner conversation, Margaret called and asked me to come to her office the following Monday morning. Her tone remained calm, but something beneath it felt purposeful. I did not tell Daniel or Vanessa about the meeting. Instead, I spent the weekend moving quietly through the house as though nothing had changed. Vanessa had already begun behaving differently around me. Not cruel exactly. Worse than cruel. Triumphant. She started showing me brochures for retirement communities during breakfast. Small apartments with smiling gray-haired couples holding coffee mugs beside artificial fireplaces. This one has a beautiful courtyard, she said one morning while placing a brochure beside my plate of toast. And transportation to nearby shops twice a week. I glanced at the photo politely. The residents all wore identical expressions. Pleasant. Empty. Waiting. It looks lovely, I answered softly. Vanessa smiled with satisfaction while Daniel remained silent beside her. Silence had become his refuge now. The place he hid whenever truth stood too close. Monday arrived cold and bright after a weekend snowstorm. I wore the navy wool coat Harold bought me during our trip to Boston 10 years earlier and drove myself into town just after sunrise. Margaret's office overlooked the harbor, where fishing boats rocked gently against the docks beneath pale winter light. The receptionist greeted me warmly and led me into the conference room where Margaret already sat waiting beside several neatly organized folders. She stood immediately when I entered and squeezed my hand gently. "How are you holding up?" she asked. It was the first sincere question anyone had asked me in months. I sat down slowly across from her. "Better now that I understand what is happening." Margaret nodded once before sliding a thick document toward me. "Then it is time you fully understand what Harold prepared." For the next hour she explained every detail carefully. Harold had created an irrevocable trust years earlier after watching one of his business partners lose nearly everything during a family dispute. The house legally belonged to the trust, not to Daniel. Not to me either, technically. But I remained sole lifetime beneficiary with complete residential rights. More importantly, Harold included a protective clause that activated automatically if any family member attempted to pressure, manipulate, or remove me from the property against my wishes. I stared down at the paperwork while my pulse slowly quickened. What happens if that clause activates? I asked quietly. Margaret folded her hands together. Daniel forfeits a substantial inheritance. The room fell silent except for the faint sound of seagulls outside the windows. How substantial? I whispered. Margaret hesitated briefly. "Several $1 million, Eleanor." I leaned back slowly in the chair as the full weight of Harold's foresight settled over me. He had known. Not with certainty perhaps, but enough to protect me long after his death. Margaret looked at me carefully across the table. Harold loved Daniel deeply, she said softly, but he worried that grief and pressure might cloud his judgment. I swallowed hard and looked out toward the icy harbor. For months I believed I had become invisible inside my own home. Weak. Replaceable. But sitting there beneath the quiet winter sunlight, I realized something important. Vanessa and Daniel had built their entire plan on one dangerous assumption. They believed I did not know my own worth anymore. Margaret slid one final envelope across the table toward me. "There is a formal family meeting scheduled here tomorrow afternoon," she said calmly. "I believe it is time certain misunderstandings are corrected." When I left the office, snow crunched softly beneath my boots as I walked toward my car. The cold air stung my cheeks, but for the first time in nearly a year, I felt steady inside myself again. Not angry. Not vindictive. Just awake. The following afternoon, Daniel drove us to Margaret's office in complete silence. Snow lined the sidewalks in uneven gray piles, and the sky hung low over the harbor like heavy wool. Vanessa sat in the front passenger seat wearing a cream-colored coat and pearl earrings, checking her reflection in the mirror every few minutes. She looked confident, relaxed even. At one point she turned slightly toward me with a sympathetic smile that felt carefully practiced. "I know today might feel emotional," she said softly, "but this is really about making sure everyone has stability moving forward." Stability. Another gentle word people use when they plan to take something from you. I simply nodded and looked out the window. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel but said nothing. Margaret greeted us personally when we arrived. Her expression remained warm toward me but professionally neutral toward Daniel and Vanessa. She led us into the same conference room where sunlight now reflected sharply off the icy water outside the windows. Several folders rested neatly on the polished wooden table. Vanessa glanced at them with poorly hidden anticipation. Daniel looked pale. We all sat down quietly while Margaret adjusted her glasses and opened the first document. "Thank you for coming," she began calmly. "As executor and legal representative of Harold Whitmore's estate trust, I felt it necessary to formally review certain protections and ownership structures that Mr. Whitmore established before his passing." Vanessa crossed one elegant leg over the other and folded her hands confidently in her lap. Daniel stared down at the table. Margaret continued reading through legal language regarding the property, financial accounts, and trust administration. Then she paused and looked directly at Daniel. "To clarify, the family residence remains entirely protected under the Whitmore Irrevocable Trust." Vanessa's smile faded slightly. "Meaning what exactly?" she asked carefully. Margaret turned a page. "Meaning the property cannot be sold, transferred, refinanced, or structurally altered without Eleanor Whitmore's direct authorization as sole lifetime beneficiary." Silence settled heavily across the room. Vanessa blinked once. "I thought Daniel inherited the house after Harold died."
No, Margaret answered calmly.
"That assumption would be incorrect." Daniel finally looked up sharply. "Wait. What?" Margaret slid another document across the table toward him. "Your father established additional conditions several years ago." I watched Daniel's face as he scanned the paperwork. Confusion shifted slowly into disbelief. Beside him, Vanessa leaned closer, her expression tightening with every line she read. Margaret's voice remained steady and professional. "Mr. Whitmore included a protection clause specifically addressing coercion, manipulation, or pressure placed upon Eleanor Whitmore regarding her residence or financial independence." The room became completely silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock behind us. Then Margaret delivered the sentence Harold had prepared long before any of us entered that office. "Should such behavior occur, all discretionary inheritance distributions assigned to Daniel Whitmore are immediately revoked and redirected into protected charitable trusts." Vanessa's entire body stiffened. "That cannot be legal," she said quickly. Margaret met her gaze without emotion. "It is entirely legal." Daniel looked physically shaken now, staring between the documents and me as though seeing me clearly for the first time in months. "Mom," he whispered weakly, "I did not know." And strangely enough, I believed him. Weakness had blinded him long before greed ever did. Vanessa recovered first. "This is ridiculous," she snapped quietly. "We were only trying to help." Margaret folded her hands together. Intent becomes difficult to defend when conversations regarding removal, refinancing, and property transfer have already been documented. Vanessa's face drained of color. Daniel turned toward her slowly, genuine shock spreading across his expression. For several long seconds nobody spoke. Then I looked down at the wedding ring still resting on my hand and thought about Harold sitting beside hospital windows during his final weeks, quietly preparing to protect me even after death. I stood up carefully and buttoned my coat. "I think I would like to go home now," I said softly. But for the first time in nearly a year, everyone in the room finally understood exactly whose home it truly was.